The photograph sat in a dusty box for over a century, its edges yellowed and curling inward like autumn leaves. To the untrained eye, it was merely another daguerreotype from the mid-19th century, a portrait of what appeared to be a mother with 3 children. Unremarkable, perhaps, save for the exceptional clarity that had somehow survived 175 years. Dr. Eleanor Wright pushed her glasses higher on her nose as she carefully lifted the image from its archival sleeve. The Smithsonian's Photographic Preservation Department had received dozens of daguerreotypes from a recently discovered collection in Charleston, South Carolina. Most were standard fare, stern-faced men in formal attire, women with tightly pulled hair and modest dresses, occasional family portraits marked by the subject's rigid postures, necessary given the long exposure times of early photography. But this one made her pause. "There's something unusual about this," she murmured to herself, angling the metal plate under the specialized light of her workstation. The silvery surface reflected back the image of a woman in her 30s, seated centrally, with 3 children positioned around her, all appearing identical in age and features. It was March 2022. Outside Eleanor's window, cherry blossoms were beginning to dot the National Mall with delicate pink, but her attention remained fixed on this fragment from 1846. "James," she called to her colleague across the lab, "could you take a look at this?" Dr. James Chen, the department's imaging specialist, approached her workstation. "What have you found?" "Look at these children," Eleanor said, pointing to the 3 small figures. "They look exactly alike." James leaned closer. "Triplets?" he suggested. "In 1846? Eleanor's voice carried a note of skepticism. The survival rate for multiple births back then was extremely low. "And look at them. They appear to be about 4 years old, healthy and remarkably identical." James nodded slowly. "Let's get this under the digital microscope. I want to enhance some details." 3 hours later, Eleanor and James stared at the high-resolution scans on their monitor, an uncomfortable silence filling the laboratory. What they had discovered had drained the color from both their faces. "This changes everything we know about the Collins family," Eleanor whispered. The Collins family, one of Charleston's prominent merchant families, whose archives had recently been donated to the Smithsonian by a distant relative, clearing out an ancestral home. The collection had been deemed historically significant, primarily for its documentation of commercial shipping routes in the antebellum South. No one had expected to find a secret that would rewrite a family's history, and perhaps add a footnote to medical history as well. "We need to find out who these children were," Eleanor said firmly, "and why there's no record of triplets in the Collins family documentation." 2 weeks later, Eleanor found herself in Charleston, standing before the imposing columns of the former Collins residence, now a privately owned historical site. The spring humidity wrapped around her like a damp blanket as she climbed the steps to meet with the current property curator. "Dr. Wright, welcome to Magnolia Place," greeted Margaret Lawson, a silver-haired woman in her 60s who had been managing the historical site for over 2 decades. "I was intrigued by your call about the Collins family. We don't often get Smithsonian researchers here." "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Eleanor replied, following Margaret into the cool interior of the antebellum mansion. "I'm hoping you might help me solve a rather unusual mystery." In the mansion's library, Eleanor carefully removed a protective folder from her bag and showed Margaret the enhanced scan of the daguerreotype. "This was taken here on the east veranda," Margaret noted immediately, recognizing the distinctive balustrade visible in the background. "That's Elizabeth Collins, wife of Jonathan Collins. But—" her voice trailed off as she studied the 3 identical children. "The Collins family records mention only one son from this period, William Collins, born in 1842, Eleanor explained. Yet here are clearly 3 identical boys, approximately 4 years old, photographed in 1846. Margaret frowned. "That can't be right. I've catalogued the Collins family history extensively. There's never been any mention of triplets." "That's precisely what makes this so intriguing," Eleanor said. "In our enhanced scans, we noticed something else." She pulled up another image on her tablet, showing a tightly zoomed section of the photograph. "Look at their wrists." Margaret leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Then her hand flew to her mouth. "Are those numbers?" Eleanor nodded grimly. 1, 2, and 3, tattooed or marked on the inner wrists of each child. barely visible to the naked eye but clear under enhancement. "My God," Margaret whispered. "Why would someone number children?" "That's what I'm trying to determine," Eleanor replied. "I need access to any private family records you might have. Journals, correspondence, medical documents, anything that might explain not just the existence of triplets, but why they've been essentially erased from the family history." Margaret's expression had transformed from professional curiosity to disturbed fascination. "The family donated most official documents to various archives, but we still have Elizabeth Collins' personal diaries in our collection. They've never been fully transcribed. Her handwriting is notoriously difficult to decipher." "I'd like to see them," Eleanor said firmly. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in her hotel room, surrounded by photocopies of Elizabeth Collins' diary entries from 1841 to 1847. The handwriting was indeed challenging, cramped and faded, but after hours of careful reading, patterns were emerging that made her stomach tighten with unease. December 18th, 1841. Dr. H has assured Jonathan that his experimental treatment will yield results. I pray for a son after 3 daughters lost before birth. February 3rd, 1842. Feeling movement much stronger than with previous pregnancies. Dr. H visits weekly now. Jonathan has invested considerably in the doctor's research. May 17th, 1842. The pains came early. What followed defies nature and understanding. Dr. H appears both shocked and elated by what he calls his triumph. Jonathan has sworn all household staff to secrecy under threat of dismissal. We will announce only 1 birth. The others remain in the nursery wing, seen only by myself and Nurse Mary. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the entry from June 1842. William thrives and receives callers. The others, may God forgive us, are referred to only by their numbers when the doctor visits. He examines them constantly, making notes on their development. Jonathan reminds me this arrangement protects the family name from unwholesome speculation and protects the children from being viewed as unnatural curiosities. "They hid them," Eleanor whispered to the empty room. "They had identical triplets, but publicly acknowledged only 1 child." She continued reading far into the night, piecing together a disturbing narrative. Dr. H, presumably Dr. Harlow, mentioned in later entries, had apparently been experimenting with fertility treatments in an era when such concepts barely existed. The Collins family, desperate for a male heir after multiple miscarriages, had somehow become early subjects of experimental reproductive medicine. The triplets were identical in every way, a medical miracle for the 1840s, but the family feared social ostracism and religious condemnation. Only William was publicly acknowledged, while his identical brothers were kept hidden within the house, their existence known only to a few trusted staff members. Most disturbing was the clinical detachment with which the hidden children were treated. They were referred to by numbers in the diary, examined regularly, and documented like specimens rather than children. Eleanor could barely sleep that night, her mind racing with questions. How long had this deception continued? What became of the other 2 boys? And how had such an extraordinary medical case, possibly the earliest documented case of triplets resulting from fertility intervention, remained hidden for nearly 2 centuries? The next morning found Eleanor at the Charleston Medical University archives, requesting access to any records related to a Dr. Edward Harlow, who practiced in the 1840s. "Harlow?" the archivist repeated. "That's an interesting coincidence. We just had another researcher looking into him last month, a medical historian from Johns Hopkins." Eleanor felt a surge of both excitement and competitive concern. "Did they find anything significant?" "I believe they did," the archivist replied, checking her records. "Dr. Abigail Patel. She was particularly interested in his experimental work. I can give you her contact information if you'd like." An hour later, Eleanor was on a video call with Dr. Patel, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "The Collins triplets?" Dr. Patel's expression shifted from professional courtesy to intense interest. "You've found photographic evidence?" "Yes," Eleanor confirmed, surprised by the immediate recognition. "You know about them?" "I've been researching early reproductive medicine in America," Dr. Patel explained. "Harlow's name appears in some medical journals from the 1850s, making vague references to a remarkable case of identical multiplication achieved through his treatments. Most medical historians dismissed it as unsubstantiated boasting, but I found his private research journals at an estate sale last year. What did they say? Eleanor asked, leaning closer to her screen. He was experimenting with herbal compounds and primitive hormonal extracts derived from animal glands, Dr. Patel said. Completely unethical by today's standards, of course, but he was convinced he could enhance fertility. The Collins case was his crowning achievement, though he never publicly named the family in his notes. Did his journals mention what happened to the triplets? Dr. Patel's expression darkened. That's where things get troubling. Harlow was not just interested in creating multiple births, he was obsessed with what he called the perfect copy. He believed identical multiples offered insight into the human soul. His later entries suggest he was conducting regular comparative tests on the children. Eleanor felt a chill. Tests? Cognitive, physical, and psychological assessments. He was testing nature versus nurture before those concepts were formally established. One child, presumably the publicly acknowledged William, was raised normally. The others were raised under controlled conditions with varying stimuli. They were treating children like laboratory rats, Eleanor said, the horror of it sinking in. Essentially, yes, Dr. Patel confirmed grimly. Harlow's last journal entry about the Collins case was from 1850, when the boys would have been 8 years old. After that, there's no mention of them. I need to find out what happened to them, Eleanor said. These were children, not experiments. I agree, Dr. Patel replied. If you're going back to the Collins estate, look for hidden rooms or modifications to the house. Harlow's notes mentioned a special observation nursery constructed for his work. Word count for part 1, 1,878 words. After spending another day at Magnolia Place, Eleanor discovered a critical clue. While examining architectural plans of the mansion, she noticed discrepancies between the original drawings and the current layout. A section of the east wing appeared to have been sealed off and incorporated into what was now storage space. With Margaret's reluctant permission, Eleanor brought in a structural engineer who confirmed her suspicions. Behind a wall in what had once been part of the nursery was a hidden chamber. We can't simply tear down walls in a historical building, Margaret protested, though her curiosity was clearly piqued. We don't need to, the engineer assured them. There's an access panel here. See how the molding doesn't quite match? It was designed to be opened. When they finally managed to slide the panel aside, revealing a narrow doorway, the musty smell of long, undisturbed air greeted them. Eleanor's heart pounded as she shone her flashlight into the darkness, illuminating a small room with faded blue wallpaper. Children's furniture, 2 beds, a small table, chairs, stood frozen in time, covered in a thick layer of dust. But it was the wall of shelves that drew their attention. Dozens of journals, specimen jars, measuring devices, and most chillingly, a collection of identical daguerreotypes showing the development of 3 identical boys, each photographed in exactly the same pose, but with their assigned numbers clearly visible on cards placed beside them. This is Dr. Harlow's observation room, Eleanor whispered, where he conducted his comparative studies. Margaret stood in the doorway, her face pale. All this time, I've given hundreds of tours telling people about the Collins family legacy of business and southern gentility, and this was happening behind these walls. History is rarely as straightforward as we present it in museums, Eleanor said gently. That's why discoveries like this matter. They show us the full complexity of the past. Eleanor spent the next 3 days meticulously documenting the hidden room's contents. Each journal, photograph, and artifact was carefully catalogued, creating a paper trail that had remained hidden for generations. The Smithsonian had dispatched a specialized preservation team to assist, recognizing the historical significance of the discovery. Dr. Harlow's clinical notes revealed a disturbing experimental approach. The journals documented daily observations of the 3 Collins boys, William, who lived openly as the Collins heir, and subjects 2 and 3, who existed in the shadowed margins of the household. April 15, 1846, Eleanor read aloud from one journal. Subject 1 continues to demonstrate advanced vocabulary, consistent with his social exposure and educational advantages. Subject 2, limited to scientific texts only, shows remarkable analytical capabilities but struggles with common expressions. Subject 3, raised with minimal verbal interaction, remains significantly behind in language, but displays heightened sensitivity to nonverbal cues and musical tones. The entries continued in this vein, detached, methodical, and utterly devoid of recognition that these were children, not specimens. The daguerreotype that had initially caught Eleanor's attention had been taken during one of Harlowe's quarterly comprehensive assessments, a rare occasion when all three boys were brought together. "There must be descendants," Eleanor told Margaret, as they carefully examined family records in the mansion's study. William Collins is mentioned in historical records as having continued the family business and having children of his own. But what happened to the others? Margaret frowned, reviewing the family Bible where births and deaths were traditionally recorded. There's nothing here about the other two. After 1850, they simply vanish from even Elizabeth's personal diaries. They wouldn't be in the family records if they weren't acknowledged as Collins' children, Eleanor reasoned. We need to look elsewhere. Were there any Collins relatives who suddenly acquired children around 1850, or perhaps trusted family employees who left service? The breakthrough came not from the Collins records, but from the Charleston Orphan House archives. Eleanor discovered an entry from September 1850. Received 2 male children, age 8, identical in appearance. Surrendered by proxy of Dr. Edward Harlowe, with annual financial provision from anonymous benefactor. Children display unusual behaviors and limited social abilities. Names assigned Thomas and James Foster. Foster children, quite literally, Eleanor murmured, tracing the faded ink with her fingertip. The Collins family didn't completely abandon them. They provided financial support, but they removed them from the household. The orphanage records offered only glimpses of the boys' subsequent lives. Thomas was apprenticed to a printer at age 12, while James was placed with a piano maker. His unusual sensitivity to tone apparently noticed by the orphanage staff. Both disappeared from Charleston records after reaching adulthood. It took another week of dedicated research before Eleanor found the next piece of the puzzle, a medical journal from 1872 containing a paper authored by Dr. Martin Williams of Philadelphia. Observational study of identical triplets separated in childhood. Implications for development and inheritance. He found them, Eleanor breathed, quickly scanning the article. Or rather, they found him. The paper detailed how 3 identical men, age 30, had discovered each other's existence through a remarkable coincidence. William Collins, a Charleston businessman visiting Philadelphia, had been mistaken for Thomas Foster, an established printer in the city. The confusion led to the discovery of a third identical man, James Foster, a piano tuner and repair specialist. Dr. Williams, a colleague of the by-then deceased Dr. Harlowe, had recognized the significance of the case and convinced the 3 men to participate in a series of interviews and examinations. Unlike Harlowe's cold experimentation, Williams' approach seemed more ethical, focusing on the men's consent and experiences. "Listen to this," Eleanor told Dr. Patel during their next video conference. Williams writes, "The 3 subjects exhibit remarkable similarities in physical features, mannerisms, and certain preferences, despite their divergent upbringings. All 3 demonstrate an unusual sensitivity to particular musical tones, share an aversion to the same foods, and report similar dreams. However, their intellectual developments, emotional responses, and social abilities vary significantly, correlating strongly with their early childhood environments. The first documented case study of identical triplets raised apart," Dr. Patel responded, her professional excitement evident. "This predates the Minnesota twin study by over a century." "It's an extraordinary find, Dr. Wright." "But it's not just a scientific curiosity," Eleanor insisted. "These were real people whose lives were fundamentally shaped by this experiment. William lived as a privileged heir, while his identical brothers were essentially treated as research subjects before being discarded to an orphanage. What happened to them after William's study?" Dr. Patel asked. "That's what I'm trying to determine now," Eleanor replied. "The paper mentions that all 3 were deeply affected by the discovery of their true relationship, but provides no further details about their subsequent interactions." The trail led Eleanor to Philadelphia, where the Historical Society maintained extensive records of the city's 19th century residents. Thomas Foster's printing business had been moderately successful, specializing in medical texts and scientific journals, an interesting choice given his childhood exposure to scientific literature in Harlow's controlled environment. James Foster's piano business had left fewer records, though Eleanor discovered advertisements for Foster's perfect pitch piano tuning in newspapers from the 1870s and 1880s, claiming a natural gift for tonal perfection. The most surprising discovery came from a small community newspaper dated December 1873, a property notice indicating that Thomas and James Foster had jointly purchased a substantial home in the Germantown area of Philadelphia. More significant was the third name on the deed, William Collins. All three brothers living together, Eleanor marveled, sharing her findings with Margaret during their daily update. After 30 years of separation, they chose to create a shared home. Perhaps they were trying to reclaim something that had been taken from them, Margaret suggested. Their brotherhood. Eleanor's research took on new urgency as she tracked down the property and discovered it had remained in the possession of the Collins Foster family for generations. The current owner was listed as Dr. Catherine Foster Collins, a neurologist at the University of Pennsylvania. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon. Eleanor sat nervously in a cafe near the university campus, rehearsing how she would explain her research to a woman who might have no knowledge of her family's unusual history. Dr. Foster Collins arrived precisely on time, a tall woman in her 50s with streaks of grey in her dark hair and an air of quiet authority. "Dr. Wright," she said, extending her hand, "I understand you've been researching my great-great-grandfathers." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "You know about them? About the triplets?" Catherine Foster Collins smiled slightly as she took a seat. "It's our family's defining story. I grew up hearing about the three identical brothers who found each other after being separated as children. Though I suspect your research has uncovered aspects even we don't know. You don't know about Dr. Harlow. The experiment?" Eleanor asked cautiously. Catherine's expression darkened. "We know they were separated as children after their mother died. We know one was raised by their father and the others were sent to an orphanage. But an experiment? No, that part isn't in our family narrative." Eleanor carefully explained her discoveries. The hidden room at Magnolia Place, Harlow's journals, the deliberate separation, and different upbringings imposed on the identical brothers. She watched Catherine's expression shift from shock to anger, and finally to a profound sadness. "My grandfather always said there was something that haunted them," Catherine said quietly when Eleanor finished. "Something they never fully disclosed to their children. William's son, my great-grandfather, told me that the three brothers would sometimes sit together in absolute silence, just looking at each other, as if they were trying to see something beyond their identical faces. I believe they were trying to understand what had been done to them," Eleanor suggested gently. "And perhaps who they might have been under different circumstances." Catherine nodded slowly. "We have their photographs. As they aged, they remained strikingly identical in appearance, yet family stories describe them as fundamentally different in temperament. William was socially adept but emotionally reserved. Thomas was intellectually brilliant but struggled with personal relationships, and James was deeply intuitive and artistic but had difficulty with abstract concepts." "Exactly as Harlow's experiment intended," Eleanor said. "He was testing whether different environments would create different developmental outcomes, despite identical genetic material." "They were treated as specimens, not children," Catherine said, anger edging her voice. "And the Collins family, my family, allowed it." "The historical context matters," Eleanor reminded her gently. "In the 1840s, the concept of ethical research simply didn't exist as we understand it today. The Collins parents likely believed they were contributing to important scientific advancement." "That doesn't make it right," Catherine replied firmly. "No," Eleanor agreed. "It doesn't." Catherine was silent for a moment, then asked, "Do you have it? The original photograph that started your investigation?" Eleanor carefully removed the preserved daguerreotype from its protective case and handed it to Catherine. "This is the only known image of all three brothers together as children." Catherine stared at the image, her professional composure momentarily faltering. "My God," she whispered, "they look exactly like my son at that age." Eleanor felt a chill run through her. Genetic traits can persist strongly across generations in some families. "They look frightened," Catherine observed, studying the children's expressions. "Even William, the one raised normally. They all look wary. The photograph was taken during one of Harlow's assessment sessions, Eleanor explained. They were being measured and tested that day. Catherine continued to stare at the image, gently touching each small face with her fingertip. What happened to them? After they reunited, Eleanor shared what she had discovered about their joint household. They lived together for nearly 20 years. William never returned to Charleston or the family business. He remained in Philadelphia and started a new commercial venture with Thomas. James continued his work with musical instruments. All three married, though only William and Thomas had children. And the Collins family in Charleston? How did they react to William essentially abandoning his inheritance? From what I've found in correspondence, they were initially angry and confused. But Elizabeth Collins had died in 1850, the same year the younger boys were sent to the orphanage. Jonathan Collins remarried and had another son who ultimately took over the family business. William's departure seems to have been gradually accepted, if not understood. Catherine took a deep breath. I have something you should see. Family artifacts passed down from the brothers. The Foster Collins home in Germantown remained remarkably preserved, maintaining much of its 19th century character while accommodating modern comforts. Catherine led Eleanor to a study lined with bookshelves and dominated by an antique desk. This was their shared space, Catherine explained, unlocking a cabinet. Each brother had his own bedroom and private study, but this room belonged to all three. They called it the triangulation room, a place where they would come together to compare their separate experiences and find common ground. She carefully removed a leather-bound volume and placed it on the desk. This is their joint journal, begun when they reunited in 1872. They took turns making entries, sometimes responding to each other's thoughts, sometimes documenting shared experiences. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken as Catherine opened the journal to the first page, written in a precise, controlled hand. October 17th, 1872. William, today marks 1 month since the extraordinary revelation that has transformed my understanding of myself. I am not, as I have always believed, an only child. I am one of three, identical in form but shaped by drastically different circumstances. Meeting Thomas and James has been like discovering parts of myself I never knew were missing. We are simultaneously the same person and completely different men. What does this mean for the notion of the soul? Are we three variations of one potential being, or three distinct souls who happen to share identical physical vessels? Dr. Williams suggests we document our thoughts and experiences as we navigate this unprecedented situation. Thomas, James, and I have agreed to maintain this shared record, hidden from outside eyes, but completely open between us three. The next entry, in a slightly more flowery script, October 18th, 1872. Thomas William approaches this as a philosophical question. I see it as a scientific puzzle. Three identical organisms, subjected to different environmental conditions, resulting in three distinct developmental outcomes. Yet beneath our differences lie unmistakable similarities, preferences, reactions, instincts that transcend our separate upbringings. When I first saw William on Market Street, I experienced a sensation I can only describe as recognition, not of another person, but of myself seen from outside. James reports the same feeling. What does this suggest about the boundary between inherent nature and imposed nurture? And finally, a more uneven, emotionally expressive handwriting. October 19th, 1872. James, my brothers, write of philosophy and science. I can only write of feelings. When we sit together in silence, I sometimes hear what I can only describe as harmonies, not with my ears, but with my being. Three notes that were meant to be played together, separated and now reunited. I dream of a childhood we never shared. I see us playing together in a garden, learning together at a table, sleeping in adjacent beds. These are not memories but visions of what should have been. I feel anger toward those who separated us, but also gratitude that we have found each other now. Is it possible to both mourn what was lost and celebrate what has been found? Eleanor read through these first entries with mounting emotion. This is extraordinary, she said softly. They're processing their situation with such different perspectives, yet there's a clear connection between them. Keep reading, Catherine encouraged. It evolves over time. As Eleanor turned the pages, she saw how the brothers' distinct writing styles gradually began to influence each other. William's entries became more emotionally expressive, Thomas incorporated more philosophical questions, and James developed a more structured approach to his observations. It was as if, through their shared journal, they were integrating aspects of each other's perspectives. An entry from 1875 caught her attention. "We have made our decision. The past cannot be undone, but the future remains in our hands. We three, who should have grown together, will now live together. We have purchased the Germantown house and will establish our unified household there. We do not seek to erase our different paths, but rather to bring them together into a whole that is greater than its parts. William will resign from his position in Charleston and join Thomas in the printing business. James will establish his piano workshop in the carriage house. We will create the family that was taken from us." Catherine watched Eleanor reading. They created something remarkable here. Not just a household, but a deliberate attempt to heal the fracture created by their separation. They raised their children together. William's 2 sons and Thomas's daughter grew up considering all 3 men their fathers. "A found family," Eleanor said, "created to mend what had been broken." "Yes," Catherine agreed, "and each generation since has maintained this house and the knowledge of our unusual origins, though until now we didn't understand the full story behind their separation." Eleanor carefully turned to the final pages of the journal, dated 1890. The handwriting was shakier, showing signs of age. "We have come to the end of our formal documentation. After 18 years of shared life, we find less need to examine our similarities and differences on paper. We have become, in many ways, a balanced whole, 3 aspects of what might have been a single life had circumstances been different. The experiment that began without our knowledge or consent has ended on our terms. We are neither purely products of our genetics nor solely shaped by our environments. We are the result of choices, both those made for us and those we made for ourselves. To our descendants who may someday read these pages, know that your lineage springs not just from blood, but from a deliberate choice to transform tragedy into harmony. The boundaries between nature and nurture, between fate and choice, are never as clear as science might wish them to be. We 3, once separated by misguided ambition, found our way back to each other. Whatever inherited traits may pass through the generations, let this also be your inheritance, the knowledge that bonds severed can be rewoven, and that family is both a gift and a creation. William, Thomas and James, October 17, 1890. Eleanor closed the journal gently, aware of the weight of history in her hands. "Thank you for sharing this," she said to Catherine. "It transforms my understanding of what I've discovered." "What will you do with your research?" Catherine asked. "The hidden room at Magnolia Place, Harlow's journals, all of it?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "With your permission, I'd like to document the full story, not just the experiment, but the reunion and the life they built afterward. It's an important historical record, both scientifically and humanly, but I'll respect your family's privacy regarding certain details." Catherine nodded slowly. "I think they would want the truth told, all of it, the violation they experienced, but also the healing they created. Too often, history focuses on the trauma without acknowledging the recovery." As they returned to the triangulation room, Catherine pointed to a large photograph hanging above the fireplace. 3 elderly men, identical in their white hair and bearded faces, seated together in the very room where Eleanor now stood. Their eyes, looking directly at the camera, held a calm certainty that contrasted sharply with the wary expressions of the children in the daguerreotype. "This was taken on their 70th birthday," Catherine explained. "The last photograph of them together. William died the following year, and the others followed within 6 months, as if, having found each other, they couldn't bear to be separated again." Eleanor studied the photograph, struck by the subtle differences that had emerged over decades, despite their identical genetic makeup. William sat slightly more formally, Thomas held a book in his hands, and James had a gentler smile than his brothers. 3 variations on a single theme, shaped by different experiences, but brought together by an unbreakable connection. "In the end," Eleanor said softly, "they reclaimed their story." "Yes," Catherine agreed. "They were numbered and separated, but they found their way back to wholeness. That's the real story behind that faded daguerreotype, not just what was done to them, but what they did in response." 6 months later, Eleanor stood in a new exhibition space at the Smithsonian. Separated and reunited, The Collins foster brothers and early medical ethics told the complete story, from the disturbing experimentation of Dr. Harlow to the remarkable reunion and shared life the brothers created. The original daguerreotype held the central position, carefully preserved and prominently displayed. Beside it hung a large reproduction of the photograph from the triangulation room, the three elderly brothers together at last. As visitors moved through the exhibition, they encountered not just the scientific and historical aspects of the case, but the deeply human story of three lives artificially divided and deliberately rewoven. Eleanor had ensured that the brothers' own words from their journal featured prominently, giving voice to those who had once been treated as silent subjects. Catherine Foster Collins stood beside Eleanor at the exhibition opening, her hand resting lightly on the shoulder of a young boy of about 10, her son, whose face echoed those in the ancient daguerreotype. "What do you think they would make of all this?" Eleanor asked, gesturing to the exhibition. Catherine considered the question, watching as her son studied the images of his ancestors. "I think they would be satisfied to know that their story is being told in full, not as medical curiosities, but as people who found their way back to each other despite everything that was done to separate them." The boy looked up at the photograph of the elderly triplets, then back at the daguerreotype of the three identical children with numbered wrists. "They look scared in the old picture," he observed, "but happy in the later one." "Yes," Catherine said, hugging him close. "That's exactly right, and that's the most important part of their story." Eleanor nodded in agreement, watching visitors move through the exhibition with expressions of shock, sadness, and ultimately, hope. The story that had begun with a disturbing discovery, experts turning pale at the sight of numbered children, had revealed itself to be not just a tale of historical exploitation, but of human resilience and the enduring power of connection. In the quiet moment before the exhibition officially opened to the public, Eleanor found herself standing alone before the daguerreotype that had started her journey. The three small faces gazed back at her across nearly 2 centuries, unnaturally separated but ultimately reunited. Their story, hidden for generations, had finally emerged into the light.